Ah, this is connected. Good. Okay. La, da, da, da. Oh wait, did stream just die? Uh-oh. Really? Did stream just die? God damn it. I hope not. That would be stupid. Failed to load module. Ah, good. I see exactly what kind of time this is gonna be. Well, nobody's here yet. So that's good news. So I can struggle with tech difficulties in this way. Okay, good business. What I will do is I will make this window smaller. No, I would like to have chat revealed to me. That. Really? There we go. Good old Twitch. Can't live with it, can't live without it. Okay, here we go. Fucking. Alright. I'm gonna go like this. Gonna put this window here. Gonna put that window there. Alrighty. So, we got a big menu. And I'll do place as well. Yeah, we'll put that there too, why not? Alright, chat. Are you ready for some spooks? No. Because you're not here. And if you guys are watching the VOD, you should totally watch last week's VOD too. Because that shit was hilarious. That was one of the best streams in a long time. Also, I know that I've just gotten everything settled in, but I have just now decided I don't like this background, so I'm changing it. I'm impossible. I am so hard to please. Okay, come on. No, I don't want that. Maybe if I go back here. Yeah, this is better. And, oh, I don't give a fuck. Alright. We'll do a little bit of that. Good. Yo, Krylix, you're just in time for spooky stories, which I have not started yet. But I think I will start with Texas because that's the one I'm staring at. Even though Texas seems to be its own horror story sometimes. Let's see. Nah, I can't do Texas without chaos. It's just not right. It's just not right. Okay. So... Probably not gonna be here long, just hiding from me in a closet for a bit. Wait, why are you hiding from me in the closet? Of all people to be out of the closet with, I would have thought it would be Mia. You know, that's what I get for making assumptions, though. Let's see. Let's do... Alright, let's do this ghost stories and hauntings one. Why not? We will do... I have no idea what I'm clicking on, but burning the midnight oil. I flipped the switch on the wall. She's in full apology mode right now, and it's starting to get on my nerves. That's fair. That is definitely fair. I hope everything smooths out. I flipped the switch on the wall, and the office lights lit up the little army of white cubicles. It was late for me to be here, but I had to get the reports finished, or life with management was going to be living hell tomorrow. Naturally, Ashley had been pissed when I told her I was coming back here tonight, and she'd instantly started bugging me again about going to the deep-sea fishing business with her brother. But I didn't get a Stanford MBA, so I could go play in the ocean, and this was the corporate game that was played. Work yourself to the bone, impress the right people, move up the ladder. Very simple. Unfortunately, Ash didn't see it that way, and our 2-year marriage was starting to strain. I guess she didn't take me that seriously the night we met when I told her I was a committed workaholic. Fortunately, the next promotion meant another $12,000 a year, and money always had a funny way of making our relationship better. The office was totally empty, which was good because I wanted to be out of there by 11 p.m. and I didn't need any distractions. When I got to my cubicle by the window, I set my laptop and my office keycard down, grabbed an energy drink from the machine in the break room, and got to work. The first hour pretty much floated by, but I could tell I wasn't going to be anywhere near done with the reports until after midnight. I was going to need some more fuel, so I pushed my chair back and went to get another Red Bull. By the time when I got back, the keycard had fallen onto the floor. I picked it up and set it back on the desk, stopping to look at the lights glittering like little blue and green jewels in the LA night. Got back to work, and about 20 minutes later, I stretched my arms out and saw, again, the keycard was gone. I looked down and saw it on the floor again. Was the desk slanted or something? It didn't seem like it was. Who cares? Just focus so you can get out of here before midnight. Another hour went by, and I hit a snag when the computer server froze up. My face got hot, and I scratched the back of my head with both hands. The server usually went out a few times a week. Sometimes it lasted a few minutes, sometimes it lasted an hour, but either way I was zero mood for this. So, got up to splash some cold water on my face, and when I got to the men's room, I pulled the door open, went over to the sink, and stared into the mirror. My eyes were a little bloodshot, and I was pretty sure a couple lines had popped up on my forehead in the past few months. Too much squinting at tiny numbers, I guessed. Putting my hands under the faucet, the water kicked on, and I splashed it onto my face. Hotness went away, and I grabbed a paper towel. Drying myself off, I tossed the paper towel into the garbage and pushed the restroom door open. Lights were flickering like they were having a seizure. Ah, fucking great, I whispered. I stood there watching the office spastically flip from light to dark for almost 30 seconds. And then the flickering suddenly stopped and the lights stayed on. My eyes ached a bit from the light show, but I couldn't let that stop me. Another hour or so and I'd be out of here anyways. I started to walk back to my desk and a sharp thud, like a stack of papers had been smacked against the desk, shot across an office. I did not read that sentence in good English. I started to walk back to my desk and a sharp thud, like a thick stack of papers had been smacked against a desk, shot across the office. Someone's here? I walked past the cubicles to the other side of the office, where the managers? I think that was supposed to be managers, but it threw me off anyway. Alright, well, I walked past the cubicles to the other side of the office, where the manager's office were lined up. All of the lights were off. No one was here. Shaking my head, I headed back to my desk. When I rounded the corner of my cubicle, I saw my laptop upside down and my chair lying on its back next to the big cane plant in the corner of the room. I'm knocking someone's teeth out. The stupid plastic chair was one thing, but the 1,500 laptop was no joke, and I felt my face get hot again. Mangers? I turned the computer over and stormed through the office. Everything was neat. Everything was quiet. The lights flickered again, and my cell beeped. It was a text from Ashley. "What time are you going to be home?" I ignored it and went back to looking around. I looked inside the break room. The microwave and the refrigerator doors were wide open. A cartoon of strawberry yogurt had been smashed into a thin, messy sheet of plastic, and pink cream was splattered all over the fridge. A deep sigh echoed through the office, and I jumped back out to the main area. Over rows of cubicles, I saw the light in the center manager's office on. I stomped over there, and once I got past the last row of cubicles, saw a stocky man with thin, wispy hair, sitting at the desk, scribbling on a yellow legal pad. He didn't work here, and the papers were scattered all over the desk, and a container of paper clips and rubber bands had spilled onto the floor. The door was wide open, and I walked up to the archway. The man looked like a blurry gray photocopy of a person. Face, hands, and a suit the color of elephant skin, and body that didn't really have any definition or detail. Yeah, the guy definitely didn't work here, but he didn't seem strangely familiar. But he did seem strangely familiar. Like I'd seen him somewhere, but no idea where. He scribbled for another few seconds, and then looked up, wrinkled a crooked nose, and pushed back his few strands of hair. Raising his arms like some construction work had just started blasting outside the window, he sighed loudly again and reached across the desk to a big stack of papers. The gray man swatted some of the papers away, then slid a thin book out from under the stack. He got up and almost seemed to glide as he moved behind the desk. When he rounded the corner, my heart seized when I saw that his feet were not touching the ground. He floated to me, stopped about a foot away, and held out the book that I could see the cover. It was the SK Digital Corporate Handbook. He opened the book, and as he thumbed through the pages, I could see that his fingers were like thick wisps of gray smoke. "Oh, Sassy! Welcome. You're not that late. This one's not that great." He then held a book out to me and pointed a cloudy finger at the top page. "Rule 2792. No one except senior management allowed on the premises past midnight." He folded his thick wavy arms and glared at me. I backed away from the office and then ran to the elevator, smacking the down button 3 times as I held my breath, waiting for the doors to open. The only thing you really missed was there was a spelling error in the story, and so managers was spelt mangers, and I had a field day with that because I'm an asshole, so of course I did. What the fuck is this? Oh! It's a ridge on my laptop that somehow, after fondling it and molesting it for so many weeks and months, I've not yet found. Okay, cool. That's just part of the machine. Awesome. Okay, here we go. No one accepting me. He folded his thick, wavy arms and glared at me. I backed away from the office and then ran to the elevator. Mangers! Well, I guess I know what murder fairies we're going to be reading about today. That's going to be clipped, isn't it? We're almost done, chat, I promise. I backed away from the office and then ran to the elevator, smacking the down button 3 times as I held my breath, waiting for the doors to open. After a heart-pounding minute, they did, and I got in and punched the lobby button. The doors closed and the elevator started moving. When the doors opened again, I shot out of the elevator, across the lobby, through the building's revolving door, and sprinted across the parking lot to the car. When I got home, Ashley was asleep. I did 3 shots of whiskey before watching TV the rest of the night. Next day, I sat at my cubicle waiting for the hammer to drop. The report was only 80% done, and I was supposed to have it turned in by 9 a.m. sharp. I'm guessing that's instant messaging. My IM window popped up. Seth, please meet me in my office in 5 minutes. From Max. A few minutes later, I was sitting in front of the office manager's desk. Work late last night, Seth? Max asked, bringing his fingertips together. Yeah, pretty late. You know the office was pretty messy this morning. Yo, Thunder Kitty. Yeah, well... Max sat back in his chair and rubbed his chin. That damn old man, he said, looking at the rows of the dozen or so framed photos on the wall. I looked over them and then saw it. In the bottom row, second to last on the left, a stocky, balding guy in a gray suit. Underneath the photo was a little plaque. Martin Sloan, office manager, 1997 to 2003. Max cracked his knuckles and chuckled. He works here 30 years, has a heart attack, and dies while burning the midnight oil, and now his ghost thinks he's owned the place after midnight. Max winked at me. You can have till 5 to turn the report in, he said, as he turned to his computer. He gave a small nod. Thanks, Max. I pushed myself out of the chair and walked out of the office. 10 minutes later, I'd cleaned out my desk, rode the elevator down to the lobby, and walked out of the building into my sunny late morning. When I got in my car, I dialed Ashley's brother's number. Seth, what's up? Not much, Jake. You still need someone to come with you on the fishing thing? I sure do. Rolled down the window and looked out at a sparkling California coastline. Well, I'm your man. Well, he just straight up ditched his job. I wouldn't blame him. It's just like, oh, my office is haunted? Alright, I'll go on a fishing expedition. Literally. Alright. Well, the famous Zerpy Zerp is here. You know what that means? Fuck. Means Wolfie still doesn't have her shit together. All these years later. Okay, there we go. Burb fact. Alright, I'll tell you when I told my family over dinner. Did you know that when female birds that look different from male birds get older, the females will start growing like kind of male plumage and they'll start looking like younger boys. Old women start looking like younger boys for birds. Shit's haunted, just go fishing. Phasmophobia fishing update, bruh. I would be all over that shit. Not even joking. Not even kidding. Alright, let's see here. La da 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 da. Ya da da ya da da da. Ya da 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 da. La da da ya da da da. Okay, here we go. Murder fairies. So this one is fucking long, but we're gonna read it anyway. Oh, never mind. We're gonna read The Rabbit's Rock from County Sligo. Fairies were usually a brooding presence in the Irish landscape. In many cases, Irish people went in terror of the other sort, avoiding spaces where they might be, or even trying not to refer to them at all. The good people were said to object to the name fairies, which they, for some reason, considered derogatory. Therefore, few country people used the terminology. If fairies took exception to an individual, and many of them did, sometimes for the most trivial of reasons, they could, at the very least, cause misfortune, and at worst, death. Closet's getting uncomfortable. Someone try to sneak in my room. If I don't come back, I get caught. Not a problem, cry. But what was feared most was abduction. It was believed that they would carry away certain people on the slightest whim, sometimes not returning them until many years later, if at all. Irish folklore is littered with tales of those who have been carried away, to return perhaps 7 years after, often still wearing the clothes that they had on when they were taken. Children were especially at risk, and many rural tales concern of infants being taken or lured away. Adults too might be abducted, and in many cases they did not come back, were doomed to spend the rest of their lives in the fairy realm. In places like Tipperary, and Kerry, several stories were to be found concerning local individuals who were supposed to be held by the others under hills and below mounds, and raths close to where they were abducted, for it was believed that the fairies did not travel all that far with their captives. On certain nights of the year, these individuals might be seen by people who knew them, appearing like ghosts, crying and pleading piteously to be released from the fairy world. Few, however, knew how to do so. Nor was it necessary for the abductee to be actually taken away from his or her surroundings by the fairies. People sometimes simply changed, lost their wits, or became incredibly withdrawn. It was then said that their essence had been captured by the fairies, and it was being held somewhere else. Thus, whilst they were physically present, their soul or mind had been removed by the good folk. This may have been used to explain an individual's mental or nervous breakdown, and hinted at the powers of the fairies over humans. This indeed is the origin of the well-known expression, "away with the fairies." Although it was difficult to retrieve such people from fairy captivity, it was not impossible. There was a certain lore in the countryside which suggested how individuals might be returned or freed, but it was often a very complicated process to do so, and might only be achieved at certain times of the year, when fairy magic might be at its weakest. Even then, it was not all that successful, for people who returned from the fairy world were often changed, dreamy, listless, and unfocused. Sometimes they would try to return to the unseen fairy realm for which they had been saved, and abduction might be followed by another. Their behavior often paralleled that of today's alleged alien abductees. Abduction by aliens from space seems to have replaced abduction by fairies in the modern mind. The following story comes from the Ox Mountain region of County Sligo, and deals with the reclamation of one of the fairy abductees. It was told by an old man, Patrick Duffy, who came from Coollaney, on the edge of the mountains, but variations of the same story are to be found in several parts of Ireland. There was a man called Anthony Mullaney, living at one time near the village of Tulligan, down near the coast in the Ox Mountains. He was a small farmer, working a holding on the slopes of the mountains, and by all accounts he was a decent and civil man. As well he should be, for his wife was the sister of a priest in Inishcrone? Inishcrone? Inishcrone. And her family was very strict. They wouldn't have tolerated Anthony Mullany as their relative if he hadn't been decent and sober in his ways. The couple had no children, but lived in a small, neat cottage up on the side of the hill above the village. Tilligan is a strange place that is steeped in the very ancient lore and legend. There is a famous well which is still today called the Hawk's Well, or some such. There's a famous well which is still called the Hawk's Well, or some such name, to this very day. In old stories, they say that Gam, a servant of the ancient king called Emran, was beheaded there for some reason, and his head was thrown into the well. Ever after, the water had a bitter taste at certain times. Another old story said that Caerthanach, the mother of devils, the last demon that even blessed Patrick couldn't drive out of Ireland, came down to drink there at night when it was dark, and that her spittle poisoned the water, making it taste strange. But everyone knew that the lands around Tilligan, up into the Ox Mountains, were badly fairy haunted. It was said that fairies hid behind every rock and every bush, waiting to carry the unwary away. Now, as I said, Anthony Mullany's wife, I think she might have been called Kathleen, but I'm not sure, was a sister to the priest in Inishcrone, and I think she had a cousin, another priest in Kilcloud, and this gave the fairies a particular interest in her. The good people take a great interest in those who come from holy families, and often try to lure them away into evil. So, with two relatives in the clergy, and maybe more, Anthony Mullany's wife drew them like a beacon, and they were determined to get her. Be sure not to come out of the closet quickly. Oh no. One evening, she was walking along the pathway that led above Tilligan and up to Hawk's Well. She had been gathering bilberries from the bushes in order to make jam, and was not at all that careful where she went. 'Twas here that the fairies came on her and took her. How they did it, nobody knew, but when she came back to her own place a good number of hours later, she was a changed woman. When she left home, she was a fine, brisk, sharp woman, as befitted her sister of a priest. But when she came back again, she was a dreamy, lazy creature who seldom spoke. She moped around the house like an old dog and did nothing, no work, no cleaning, nothing. And as the days passed, she grew steadily worse, gradually withdrawing from everything. In the end, all she would do was sit in a corner of the kitchen, moaning softly to herself and groaning loudly when anyone spoke to her or asked after her. Either that or bare her teeth like an animal. She wouldn't wash nor cook. She had to be lifted and laid and put into bed. Anthony Mullany was at his wit's end. He really wasn't sure what had happened to his wife, so he sent for her brother over in Inishcrone. The priest came with his black coat and his Bible under his arm and looked at her. When he was there, she simply groaned all the louder and snapped at him like a dog when he came too close. The fairies have that sort of way about them with priests. They've no great love of the cloth. "There is something not natural here," said the priest. "Something that might lie in the spirit world. I'll have to think further about this." It was always the way with priests. They never act right away when they're faced with something that they're not sure of. They always need time to pray and reflect. And so he went back to Inishcrone to think about the matter and consult his holy commentaries. In the meanwhile, Kathleen Mullany grew even worse. As soon as the sun went down, the fairies drew close to the house and began to scream and shriek in the most alarming manner. Their voices high and shrill like the cries of young foxes or curlews, and Anthony's wife would answer them with screams of her own, just as shrill and piercing. When he walked up in the hills, Anthony could hear the fairies calling to him in their shrieking voices, from every hidden hollow, and from behind every rock and bush, and he knew full well that they were being answered from his own house, and he didn't know what to do about it. The priest returned from Inishcrone, with books under his arm. He arrived in a great hurry late in the day, just as the sun was beginning to set. "I was right," he said grandly. "There is fairy work here. My sister's wits have been taken by the good people, and they have left her in a husk, as you see before you. I have struck her because she's a sister of a priest and has a cousin of a priest as well. She must be exorcised from their influence and her wits returned to her." He spoke with great certainty and authority, and Anthony Mullany knew better than to argue with him. "Go and prepare the kitchen now, and I will pray for her deliverance. Priests are always great at praying." Yes, this is a true statement. I had to read it twice to make sure I read it correctly. And so the kitchen of the cottage was swept and cleaned, all while the woman sat in the corner and groaned. And then the priest came in with his stole about him, and his cassock buttoned up to the neck, the scent of incense on his hands. With him he brought several old books full of prayers and ritual, that he spread out on the kitchen table. The priest prayed. He prayed hard and he prayed formally, without emotion, even though it was his own sister. He prayed in Latin, he prayed in Irish, and he prayed a bit of the time in English. He prayed until the sweat stood on his forehead. He prayed for the forgiveness of any sin his sister had committed, and which had drawn the fairies to her. He prayed that she would be kept safe, and her wits would be returned to her. He prayed that the fairies would leave her alone thereafter, that she would be free of the fairy taint. And while he prayed, the fairies grew close around the house in the gloom and shrieked and screamed and tapped on the darkened windows with their long fingernails. And Kathleen Mullany answered them with screams of her own. But eventually, the sounds outside fell away, and with a loud groan, the woman collapsed into what appeared to be a sound slumber. "There," said the priest. "The exorcism is done, and she is at rest now. When she comes to herself, her wits will have been returned to her. And that is the power of prayer. That is the power of the Lord." And with that he closed his ancient books of prayers and rituals and departed into the night. As he went, there were a few shrieks from hidden spaces in the darkness, but the fairies never bothered with him. It seemed that all would be well now. But it wasn't. For when the woman woke up again, she was as bad as ever. In fact, she was twice as bad as she'd been before. She roared and screamed and tried to bite her husband, and for every one of her shouts the fairies in the hills around her answered her. None of the priest's prayers or holy incantations seemed to have worked. There was no point in sending for him again, even though he was her brother. Besides, Anthony Mullany had another plan. Away in the Ox Mountains beyond Tulligan, he had heard of a woman living who had knowledge of the fairies and their ways. She lived alone, and some people said that she was fairy touched, and was wandering in the head. But all agreed that she had great power and great knowledge about her. Her name was Grey Ellen, and none knew her last name. She had been carried away by the fairies when she was a child, and had lived among them for more than 7 years, and had gotten to know their habits and weaknesses. The time had marked her, but she was still consulted by the country people who were fairy-ridden. And it was to her that Anthony Mullany thought of going, for now he had no faith in the power of priests. So he put on his best borgs and went striding up into Ox Mountains. He travelled along the lonely trails, through narrow valleys and along the banks of streams. He walked for miles round the edges of bogs and climbed steep slopes where the loose scree had slipped down and almost barred his way. The place where Grey Ellen lived was no more than a small hut, made of stones and mud, and set at the upper end of a glen between frowning cliffs. It was thatched with leaves and rushes, and as Anthony Mullany drew close to it, he saw a thin trail of blue smoke rising above it, which told him that the strange woman was at home. Knocking on the doorpost, he looked inside. Grey Ellen sat on a low stool in front of the fire of rushes and twigs, smoking her pipe and stirring something in the black pot, which bubbled and seethed among the ashes. The hut was almost bare, for there was little furniture, only a few old chests, with ragged blankets thrown over them. The low makeshift bed, no more than a straw mattress, in one corner. All around hung bunches of dried flowers and plants, that the odd woman had gathered on the mountain. The only light came from a lantern that hung from a pole in the centre of the earthen floor. Grey Ellen barely looked up when Anthony Mullany came round her door.
"I knew you were coming,"
she told him, in a thin, faraway voice.
"For I heard the fairies crying in the glen below. 'Twas them that told me."
She was very thin, her arms little more than sticks as she stirred the pot, and grey hair that gave her name hung down about her narrow face in long greasy cords. She wore what looked like an old coat that had once been green or blue, but was now so shabby and dirty that you couldn't make out the true colour of it. And as she stirred the pot with a long stick, her eyes had a certain dreamy quality about them, as if they might be fixed on sights that were far away.
"I know why you've come,"
she continued.
"This is a bad time of year for the fairies, for they're greatly agitated and at their worst mischief. They steal away the children, and sometimes injure or take away the wits of good Christians. I know your wife is very touched, and this is because she is the sister of a priest, and the fairies have taken a spite against her because of it. They've muddled her mind so that she can't think right and wanders about like a dead thing."
Anthony Mullany was astounded that she knew so much about the circumstances, but then Grey Ellen was supposed to have great powers that she'd been given by the fairies themselves. "What should I do about her?" he asked. "Her brother, the priest, came and read over her from the holy books and commentaries, but it made no difference. She slept for a while, but she woke, she was bad as ever, and the fairies came round the house shrieking and tapping on the window panes to stir her up." Grey Ellen nodded and spat into the fire. Something stirred and moved in the shadows of the hut. A cat or a large rat, perhaps.
"The clergy are useless in these sorts of things," she answered. "They hide behind their religion in the church. The fairies know of no such things, nor are they truly bound to them, for they were here long before the Christians came, and their ways are far older than any of the church or priest. And the chanting and praying has no effect on them at all."
She gave the pot another stir.
"But you can get your wife back and restore her to her full wits, if that is your wish."
"'Tis my wish indeed," said Anthony Mullany. "Tell me what I have to do." There was silence in the hut for a moment, and a dark, unseen thing scurried and whispered in the corners.
"You can't recover her right away,"
Grey Ellen told him, "for such people can only be brought back from the fairy realm at certain times, when the fairy power is weakest. One night on the next full moon, which is very close now, you must go up onto the southeastern slope of Tulligan Hill, where the servant of Ehrman was beheaded,
to a place called the Rabbit's Rock. Do you know it?"
Anthony Mullany said that he did, although he knew it under another name. It was a place where rabbits gathered in the shade of a large rock to escape the heat of the sun.
"Go there, and take with you an iron knife that has been dipped in well water. Go just before midnight, and wait. Keep close to the rock itself, and don't make a sound or sudden motion, or the fairies will know that you are there, and will take revenge on you. Around the stroke of 12 you will see a number of horsemen riding up the hillside toward the rock. These are very kind, who use the spot as a gathering place. Look between the first two horsemen, and you will see your wife riding on a pure white horse, and tied to the riders on either side of her by a silver rope. She will not see you, nor recognize you, for her mind is still with the fairies. Stay where you are, and do not make any movement or cry out until they are almost beside you. Then run forward and cut the silver rope on both sides using the iron knife that has been dipped in the well water. Once the rope has been cut, the spell that binds her to the fairies is broken, but they may still have a hold over her, so you must lift her down from the horse and run with her as fast as you can, for the fairies will throw bolts and lances after you, any of which will hit you, will take you away your own wits and powers." She spat into the fire, and the spittle sizzled and hissed on the corners of the ashes. "There is one other thing I must tell you, and it is most important. In all the time you are at the Rabbit's Rock until your wife is freed and back in your own house, you must not say a word, or she will be lost to you forever." She poked the fire with her stick and said no more. Anthony Mulaney looked fixedly at her. "And what happens if I should fail?" he asked softly. Grey Ellen laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound to hear, for it was like the sharp cackle of a bird on the mountainside. "You had better pray that you don't. If you think that you might fail, it's best to leave your wife as she is, for the fairies will take their revenge on you, and that revenge will be sore. If you are lucky, they will only take your wits from you, but it is possible they would take your life. Aye, and take it slowly and painfully, and then have their amusement with your soul. Will you go to the Rabbit's Rock, then, Anthony Mulaney?" The man drew himself to his full height in front of the old woman. "I still want my wife back as she was," he declared, "and I'll go to the Rabbit's Rock if I have to, in order to fetch her home." Outside of the glen, he thought that he had heard the fairies screaming and wailing, and the blood grew cold in his veins. Grey Ellen nodded. She fumbled inside her dirty coat and drew something out. "You are either very brave or very foolish," she told him. "Few mortals ever cross the fairies. But if you are in difficulties, take this." And she handed him some sort of thing that looked like a small stone that had been sharpened to a point. In the firelight it glinted like a metal, and Anthony Mulaney had never seen anything like it. As he took it from her and held it up to the light, he thought that he saw a vague tracery of some sort, of spidery writing, written across the broadest part of it. "This is a fairy bolt," went on the old woman, "but it is one with special powers. If you get into trouble with the fairies, throw this at them. It is marked with a special spell. They should not be able to harm you if it hits them. But be warned, the effects of the spell will only last a few minutes. Then the fairies will be more angry than ever, and more dangerous. But it might buy you time to get away from them." Anthony Mulaney took the stone from her. It seemed a little warm to the touch. "It is the magic that's in it," explained Grey Ellen, as she could read his thoughts. "It is a far more powerful thing than the mutterings of any priest or bishop, or the words that to be found on any of the books they carry. Use it only if you have to, for its powers will not last long. I'm giving it to you because I like your spirit. The fairies can be very dangerous, and it's not many that would go and have the heart to stand up to them. Take it with my blessing and go, for I am very tired. It's getting very dark, and the fairies are getting restless below the glen." And she seemed to sink back into her old thoughts, as if he were no longer there. Anthony Mulaney turned, and leaving the narrow hut, walked back down the glen, hearing the faint cries of the fairies from their hidden hiding spots among the rocks. He didn't tell the priest, his wife's brother, that he'd been up in the Ox Mountains or that he'd visited Grey Ellen. The cleric might have had something to say about consorting with such people. He simply waited for the next full moon to come round, and when he did, he would go up to Rabbit's Rock, and 'twas not long until he did so. As the sun started to dip in the sky, he took an iron knife and went to a well near his house. Dipping the blade in cold water, he made sure it was spotless clean. Then, putting it in his pocket, and making sure that he had the fairy bolt under his shirt, he set out for the rock. The Rabbit's Rock was about halfway up Tulligan Hill, a great finger of stone, about twice the size of a man grown up, pointing up to the sky and tucked away into some kind of dip in the land. This made it a dark and shadowy place, where things seemed to come and go that neither had shape or form. But it was a place where wild animals sometimes went for shelter, and humans avoided. Some of the older people of the locality said it was fairy haunted. It was very late in the evening, and the daylight was just starting to fade when Anthony Mulaney reached it. Even as he grew close to it, he could feel the air getting slightly colder. When he walked up to the rock itself, in its shadow, he waited to see what might happen. The air grew even colder, and the sun went down, and a darkness crept up on Tulligan Hill. But Anthony Mulaney stayed on. A bird called away in the valley below him, and something small ran across the ground in front of him, although he couldn't see what it was. Still he stood, where he was, the knife in his hand, never making a sound. He waited and waited, until the night grew colder and colder. Nothing happened apart from the occasional call of an owl or a fox. There was no sound. He was thinking of walking back down the hill and going home again, when he thought that he saw movement away down the slope. There were dark shapes riding up the hill toward Rabbit's Rock, and they seemed to be those of tall men on horseback. There was a group of them, about 6 or 7, and they rode very slowly indeed. Anthony Mullany waited, praying that the moon would come out from behind a hidden cloud and show him what was farther down the hill. And out did it come, and it filled the hillside with a yellow light, so that he could see what was coming up toward him. He had been right. There were about 6 or 7 tall people. He could not tell whether they were men or women, mounted on dark horses and dressed in dark, flowing, old-fashioned clothes. The horses stepped very high and moved very slowly. It was almost as if they were riding through treacle? I'm not sure what that means. Time for Google. Do. Oh, syrup. Yeah, that makes sense. The faces of their riders, and so much as he could see them, were very pale, almost to the point of being chalk white. Thickwood, pretty much. Thickwood. I like that word. Every time I see that word, I'm gonna turn it into thickwood. The faces of the riders, and so much as he could see them, were very pale, almost to the point of being chalk white. In fact, they almost looked like skulls, long and thin. They wore heavy cloaks, coloured black and dark green and red, which hung on them like old sacks. Their hands that held the horse's bridle and reins were long, thin and pale, and had nails like birds' claws. Some of them wore veils across their faces, like the lacy veil of a bride, but this did nothing to hide their terrible faces in the moonlight. First thing I hear when I come in is Thickwood. Hey, Chaos Dragoon, we're reading about murder fairies. Like birds' claws. Some of them wore veils across their faces, like the lacy veil of a bride, but it did nothing to hide their terrible faces in the moonlight. The very sight of them made Anthony Mullany want to cry out in sheer fright. But then he remembered what Grey Ellen had told him, and kept quiet. As the awful shapes drew near, Anthony saw that there was one among them that wasn't a fairy, even though the horse she sat on moved as slowly as the others. Through the great thickwood, in the moonlight, he recognized his own wife, sitting in the middle of the dark fairy shapes. She seemed to be bound to 2 of them by a long silver rope, just as Grey Ellen had said, and she looked very woebegone and down at heart. She rode with her eyes downcast and fixed on the ground beneath her, like a prisoner that has given up all hope of escape. Anthony Mullany's heart went out to her from the shadow of Rabbit's Rock, but still he waited as the terrible procession drew nearer. Eventually they drew almost level with the rock, but still he waited. And then, as Kathleen came forward, he raised the iron knife that had been dipped in the well water and ran forward. The silver rope was hanging on down between the dark horses, and this is what he had his eye on. With a twist of his wrist, he cut one rope, surprised at how easily it parted. The dark horses reared, and the riders raised their hands in anger, their mouths open, showing rows of sharp teeth, and their shrieks and screams filled the air all around Rabbit's Rock. Running round to the other side, quicker than a rabbit himself, Anthony Mullany cut the other rope, He made to pull his wife down from the saddle of the horse. A fairy struck out at him with a big cudgel, spiked on one end, but he missed. The screams grew louder and pained his ears, but he lifted his wife down from the horse. As soon as her feet touched the ground, recognition returned to Kathleen's dead eyes, and she knew who he was. She would have said something, but he motioned to her to be silent and run, and they did. Down the slope they went toward the seashore, below where the fairies had wheeled and danced about, their horses pawing at the air. As Anthony and his wife ran, things rattled off the ground around them, and he knew that these were fairy bolts, and if one hit either of them or her, they were finished. Half turning, he brought his own bolt, the one Grey Ellen had given, and threw it back at them. As soon as it touched the ground, it roared up in a great fountain of fire, sending fairies and their horses falling back. But one broke away and came galloping after them, swinging the great cudgel that had spikes all over its end. It had nearly drawn level with them, and Anthony Mullany pushed his wife forward to avoid the swinging weapon. "Get down!" he shouted. Then he realized what he had done, for the whole scene faded away before him, as if it had been no more than smoke, and his wife with it. He was alone on the bare slope of Tillgan Hill, just below the Rabbit's Rock. There wasn't a soul near him, neither human nor fairy. From all the hidden places round about, he heard the screams and cries of the fairy kind. It seemed to him that they were shouting in triumph. And so he went home, back to his own place. He went home alone. He came to find Kathleen lying in bed as if in a swoon. She had been able to go about before, however imperfectly, but now she just lay there, like a log in the fireplace. She made no move or anything. He put her onto the bed and sent for her brother, that was the priest in Inishcrone. He came quickly enough, but there was nothing he could do for her. And that was the way of it. She was not dead, but she might as well have been, for she made no movement afterward. She simply lay in bed all the time and wasted away. And Anthony Mullany looked after her, for she was his wife, and the sister of a priest. But from that day until she died, there was never a flicker in her eye, nor a word or sound on her lips. And at night Anthony would sit by her bed while she slept, and the fairies cried and screamed in the valleys, and among the trees between his house and the Elks Mountains. And sometimes he thought he had heard the voice of his wife amongst their calls, weeping and pleading, crying maybe, for salvation that would never come. Wasn't that a terrible burden for any man? Translator's notes, or note of the anthology person. Anthony Mullany seems to have been very unlucky. In many cases, the captive is saved from the clutches of the fairies and returns home unharmed and well. Had he not spoken, this would have most probably been the outcome. However, in many parts of Ireland, the notion of silence is paramount when dealing with the supernatural. The breaking of the no-noise rule, either by speaking, dropping something, or making some other sound, will most certainly invalidate all that is good and helpful in any magic. Words and sounds, it is assumed, had some sort of negating supernatural power of their own, which would thwart all the best efforts of humans to deal with fairy powers. Variations of this tale, mostly with more positive outcomes, are to be found in other parts of Ireland, including a celebrated one from the slopes of Brenbradagh Mountain near Limavady, County Derry, serving to demonstrate the widely perceived interaction between humans and the fairy kind. And that, my friend Zerp, finally, is one of the murder fairy stories. At long last. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're still here.
Alright. What do we want to do next, chat? Murder fairies! Whee! I have more of them if you want, Zerp. But we can shake it up if chat wants something else. We've got stories from, oh my god, what are they called? Law enforcement. We have law enforcement. We have stories about ghost hunting. Although I haven't really looked at them. Actually, no, I just looked at it. It's more of a manual. We've got Pennsylvania. We've got so much Texas. We have Victorian England. We have just random haunted stuff. Totally up to you, chat. Somebody can just throw something in there, and I'll do it, or I'll do the closest thing I've got to it. We've also got the Chinese stuff, Russian stuff, Scottish stuff, more Irish stuff as well. We've got pretty much the whole menu, boys. We got New York, we've got Scandinavia. We have those crazy fucking Russian stories we had last time. So much Texas. Do I need to take a shot every time I say something about cattle? I think I'll die of alcohol poison. Actually, a surprising number of these don't have to do with cattle. I can show you. Here we go. Chaos is here, right? I'll take anything. I'm just doing my bake prep. I have a forked tongue. I can't say goddamn anything. Yeah, I see chaos in here. That means I have the Great British Bake Off. Alright, for that I'll do Victorian next. As soon as I can fucking find it. Oxford Book of Victorian Ghost Stories. Alright. We will do Amber from Dallas, Texas. Oh Lord. If you guys haven't seen last week's episode of this, let's just say we had a lot of fun with the accents. Alright, now I just need to try not to be Irish. Oh, you hear about the stories on how dangerous Luigi boards are? I'm not gonna call them Ouija boards, or Ouija boards. I don't even know how to spell them correctly anymore. They're just Luigi boards now. I can't. Are they just Ouija boards? I've forgotten how to pronounce them anything other than Luigi boards. I'm nowhere near that level, but I appreciate your comp. Okay, those peanut butter things you made me that one time, like, I would kill a king for those. Those were so good. Sassy undersells herself. Those were fucking crazy. Those were so good. If I didn't know any better, I'd say she bewitched them. They were so good. We could not stop eating them. Just, they were, yeah. Definitely Wolfie's seal of approval here. For certain. Anyway, back to Luigi boards.
Oh, you hear the story about how dangerous Luigi boards are? But hey, it's just a game. Can't hurt anything, right? So Mary pulled out one at her sleepover party. We laughed a little nervously and agreed to play. There were 4 of us all together. Sarah, Jessie, me, and of course Mary. It was a strange-looking board covered with letters and symbols and the words yes and no. There was a plastic pointer that was supposed to move across the board at the behest of the spirits. The instructions called it a planchette. If it's a Luigi board, it must be a demon. I mean, you right. You right. Instructions called it a planchette. The sight of the board made me nervous, but I put down to the late hour and the scary reputation of the game. Mary had cleverly waited until midnight, so-called witching hour. I heard the witching hour is actually at 3 a.m., but we'll call it midnight. To begin our little game. That gave us some girls' chills, but sheer peer pressure brought all 4 of us around the table to play. At first, there was much giggling and questions about boys and schools and who would marry whom. Silly answers came up on the board, and it was obvious that Mary and Jessie were pushing the planchette around themselves, though they swore up and down that they weren't. Around 1:30 in the morning, the planchette suddenly froze in Mary's hand. Wouldn't move, no matter how much we pushed and pulled it. That creeped me out something fierce. It was as if the little device had suddenly become part of the board. Now stop it, I told Mary. It's scaring everyone. It's not funny anymore. Oh my god, I got... That was a weird hybrid of Irish and Texan. Or Southern, at least. Mary turned her frightened blue eyes toward me. I'm not doing it, she said, lifting up her hands. I grabbed the planchette myself and tried to push it around, but it was fixed to the board. Suddenly, a kind of electric shock buzzed through my fingers. I grasped and tried to pull my fingers from the planchette, but they were fixed on the plastic device as if I'd used some kind of instant glue. Mary and Jessie both tried to pull my fingers away, but they got an electric shock of some kind that made them jump away from the table. The other girls stared with wide, round eyes, and Sarah began whimpering as the planchette came alive under my fingers, which were still stuck to the surface, and began to move. Help. The word spelled out under my hand. Help me, help me. Jessie spoke the words in a trembling voice, as each one spelled itself on the board. Sarah made a choking sound, and Mary started asking questions. The planchette kept moving back and forth between H-E-L-P continuously, until Sarah cried out, "Who are you?" Then the rhythm of the spelling changed. Amber, the board spelled. My name is Amber. I'm 8 years old. What's wrong? Mary asked in a voice pitched much higher than normal. Her face was so white all the freckles stood out like darkened age spots. Amber. Water, danger, help, scared. Well, I guess this person's not in the water cult. The word spelled out as fast as my hand could move. Help me, help me. Call 911, Mary cried suddenly. Quick, Amber's in danger. As Sarah ran for the phone, I shouted, We don't know where she is. Amber, where are you? By this time, Sarah was gasping into the phone. She listened a minute and cried, Wait, please, this isn't a joke. Then she hung up the phone. They wouldn't listen to me, she told us, almost in tears. At that instant, the planchette stilled on the board, and my hand was suddenly free from the mysterious force that had held it tight. She's gone, I gasped, pulling my hand away. We stared at one another, all of us shaken to the core by what just happened. See if you can contact her again, Mary said urgently. We need to know if she's okay. Girl, okay. Honey, anyone who's contacting you through a Luigi board is already very much not okay. Like, this is Luigi board 101. Like, if somebody is trying to talk to you using a Luigi board, they can't exactly just, like, shoot you a quick text or type you up a nice fancy email at that point. Girl, she did. There's no amount of 911 help that she's gonna get that's gonna make this alright. Hesitantly, I picked up the plastic planchette again. Amber, are you there? I asked softly, afraid of what might happen. After a long pause, it moved slowly across the board and spelled out the words. Too late. Sarah broke out into tears and Jessie wrung her hands. No one should be surprised by this. Ask her what happened, Mary said softly in her ear. I nodded and stammered out the question. Water. Flood. Drowned. The planchette stopped after the last terrible word. Where was the flood? I whispered the question around the lump in my throat. I could feel tears streaming down my cheeks. Mobile, Alabama. The planchette grew heavy under my hand. Last few letters spelling out so slowly I thought Amber would disappear before she finished. And the planchette quivered to life one more time and spelled out, "Thank you for trying." It stopped suddenly, and instinctively I knew Amber was gone. None of us got much sleep that night. In the morning, we rushed through breakfast and then looked up the Alabama news on the internet. None of us were surprised to read that there had been flash floods the night before. No list of victims were released that morning, but later that day, when I checked again from my home computer, I was able to read names of those who had died in the flood. One of the victims was an 8-year-old girl named Amber. Damn, that's fast service from that Luigi board in that case. Although I'm not sure how they would have been able to help at that point. So that's Texas. Goddamn demons, right? I mean, that demon may as well be a oh fucking what are they called? Weather person. Alright, and now I promised you guys, oh my god, this book is janky as fuck, but there's gotta be a tale of contents here, right? Alright, now, fuck this one. I have another one. I'll figure out how to get that one to work in my own time. Oxford Book of English Stories. I'm getting the sense that Oxford might not be what I want here. Victorian. Where is it? I know it's here. I bet it's right in fucking front of me.
Give me a second. I'm sorry. Did I not get that one? Hold on, chat. If that's the case, I gotta find that real quick. But yeah, you guys can chat in the meantime, or talk about what other kind of stories you want me to read tonight, or anything at all, really, as I figure out what the fuck I did wrong and why I don't have what I thought I had. I have real demonic possessions if you guys want that. And also crime stuff. But not... I could have sworn up and down. Did I just... ignore? Oh, here it is. English. Doesn't have Victorian in it. Why the fuck did I think it did? Alright, but oh god, it's not... The formatting of these things leave much to be desired. Oh lord. Okay, I'm gonna scroll to the first one I can identify as a story. Alright. The Phantom Coach, from Amelia B. Edwards. The circumstances I'm about to relate to... Oh my lord, what the fuck is that accent? Highweather, get your shit together. The circumstances I'm about to relate to have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is vivid, as if they had been taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During these 20 years, I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on the subject is quite made up, and having the testimony of my own senses to rely on, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season, I had been out all day with my gun, and had had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December, the place Bleak-Wide Moor, in the far north of England, and I had lost my way. 'Twas not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand, and stared anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills, some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, nor the tiniest cultivated patch or fence or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on,
and to take my chance of finding whatever shelter I could by the way. So I shouldered my gun again and pushed wearily forward, for I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with a darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlour, and thoughts of all suffering in the store for her throughout this weary night. We'd been married 4 months, and having spent our autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of great English moorlands. We were very much in love, and of course very happy. This morning when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I have not given to have kept my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. After all this time, the snow fell and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then. My shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travellers who had walked on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all this dark long night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way? When I too must sleep the sleep of death? Death, I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay all so bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart, but that thought, was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered, or did I only fancy that I heard a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man in a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he, sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear that I should be lost in the snow." Then, folks do get cast away hereabout from time to time. What's to hinder ye from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded?" "If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, friend, we must submit," I replied. "But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I from Dolding?" "A good 20 miles, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "Nearest village is Wyke. That's 12 miles t'other side." "Where do you live, then?" "Out yonder," said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. "You're going home, I presume?" "Maybe I am." "Then I'm going with you." The old man shook his head, and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. "Ain't no use," growled he. "He won't let you in, not he." "We'll see about that," I replied briskly. "Who's he?" "Master." "Who's the master?" "That's naught to you," was the unceremonious reply. Well, well, you lead the way, and I'll engage the master shall give me shelter and supper tonight." You can try him," muttered my reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled, gnome-like, away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness. The huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. "Is this the house?" I asked. "Aye, it's the house. Down by." and he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute, he turned the key and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked round with curiosity and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served apparently a variety of uses. On one end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with sour flax, flour sacks, fucking hell, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the centre of the floor stood some large object, gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth, and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw to my surprise a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude movable platform, with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate with its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches from diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument, and asking myself whether or not it was the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "As for you," said my guide, with a malicious grin, "yonder's in his room." He pointed to a low black door at the opposite of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in, without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from the table covered with books and papers, and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" said he. "How you come here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law. On foot across the moor. Meat, drink, and sleep." He bent his bushy brows into a portentous frown. "Mine's not a house of entertainment," he said, haughtily. "Jacob, how dared you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me over the mirror, and shoulders his way in before me. I ain't no match for 6'2". "Pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning. The right to self-preservation." "Self-preservation?" "There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied briefly, "and it would be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak." He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay, if you choose, till morning, Jacob. Jacob, serve the supper." With this, he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies from which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair up to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangements than the hall's, this room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were in parts scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios, the other a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of a cupboard at the further end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantel-shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen, yet seemed it stranger still, to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again, I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair. It had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth, the same stem furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened, and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed the book, rose, and with more courtesy of a manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir, said my entertainer. Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies in our larder. I had already fallen upon the viands, and now protested with an enthusiasm of a starving sportsman that I had never eaten something so delicious. He bowed stiffly, and sat down to his own supper, which consisted primitively of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray, and I drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly toward me, said, Sir, I've lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time, I've not seen many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting the outer world, from which I have parted company for so long? Pray interrogate me, I replied. I'm heartily at your service. He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees, and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the later progress of which, as applied to practical purposes of life, he was most wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied, as well as my slight information permitted. But the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence, and only thought aloud. I'd never heard anything like it then. I'd never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all the systems, of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and still leaning forward in the same moody attitude with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer, from practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity to the wire, to electricity in the nerve, from Watt to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and mystics of the East were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious to his lips, as sequences in music. By and by I forgot by what link of conjecture or illustration. He passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line of even conjectural philosophy, and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, species, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. The world, he said, grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fatal all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstitions have they waged so long and obstinate a war? As against belief in apparitions. And yet, what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various, attested by all races of men, in all ages and in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savage of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. The circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes which effects, however valuable in physical science, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is contemned a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool. He spoke with bitterness, and having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands, and added, with an altered voice and manner, "Aye, sir." Paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from the field of science which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then, I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me, as I have forgotten the world. You have my history. "It is a very sad one," I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer.
"It is a very common one," he replied. "I have only suffered the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me."
He rose, as if desirous of ending the conversation, and went over to the window.
"It has ceased snowing," he observed,
as he dropped the curtain, came back to the fireside. "Ceased!" I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. "Oh, if it were only possible, but no, it's hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight."
"Walk 20 miles tonight?" repeated my host. "What are you thinking of?"
"Of my wife," I replied, impatiently. "My young wife, who does not know that I have lost my way, and is at this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror."
"Where is she?"
"At Wolding, 20 miles away."
"At Wolding," he echoed, thoughtfully. "Yes, the distance, it is true, is 20 miles, but are you so very anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours?"
"So very, very anxious that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse."
"Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate," said he, smiling. "The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Wolding, passes within 5 miles of the spot, and will be due at a certain crossroad in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor, put you in the old coach road,
You could find your way, I suppose, to where it joins the new one.
Easily, gladly.
He smiled again, rang the bell, and gave the old servant his directions. And taking a bottle of whiskey and a wine glass from the cupboard, in which he kept his chemicals, said, "The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight on the moor. A glass of usquebaugh before you start." I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like a liquid flame, and almost took my breath away. "It is strong," he said, "but it will help keep out the cold. And now you have no moments to spare. Good night." I thanked him for his hospitality, and would have shaken hands, but he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute I had traversed the hall, and Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out on the wide white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead, not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed, with my gun over my shoulder, as little indicated for conversations as herself. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears. His eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day with surprise how my overexcited brain retained the whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images, and fragments of splendid reasoning, in the very words in which he uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard, and striving to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Wow. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt, and said, "Yon's your road. Keep your stone face to your right hand, and you can't fail the way." "This, then, is the old coach road?" "Ay, 'tis the old coach road." "And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?" "Nigh upon 3 mile." I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative. "The road's fair road enough," said he, "for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for the northern traffic. You'll mind where the parapet's broken away, close against the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "What accident?" "Yeah, the night mail pitched right over the valley below. A good 50 feet and more. Just the worst bit of the road in the whole country." "Horrible. Many lives lost?" "All. 4 found dead, and t'other 2 died next morning." "How long has it been since it's happened?" "Just 9 year." "Near the post sign, you say? I'll bear it in mind. Good night."
"Good night, sir, and thank you."
Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretence of touching his hat, and trudged back the way he came. I watched the light of his lantern until it quite disappeared, then turned to pursue my way home. This was no longer a matter of slightest difficulty, for, despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. How silent and how solitary. A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head and accumulated them at compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had just been listening, and to some extent I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, although I walked fast and found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though, instead of traversing a quiet North County highway, I was scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I at first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first, and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle. It seemed strange that any private vehicle should be taking a road professed disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and I even fancied that I could already see the dark outline of a carriage between them. It was coming up very fast, quite noiselessly, as the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark, without observing the signpost? And this could be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time. For here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, one outside passenger, and 4 streaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only a moment. The coachman pulled up, the guard muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble. Neither answered my hail, nor made the slightest effort to dismount. On the outside passenger didn't even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travellers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than the outer air. It was pervaded by a singular damp and disagreeable smell. I looked round at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men, and all silent. They seemed to be asleep, but each leaned back in the corner of the vehicle as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbour. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he never answered a word. At any other time I should have felt or perhaps expressed some annoyance, but at the moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and turning to my left-hand neighbour, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered by a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation apparently of years. My attention thus being drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly, and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in its last stage of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. The sashes splintered at a touch, leather fittings were crusted over with mould, and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away under my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been mouldering away for years, to do another day or 2 of duty on the road. I turned to the 3rd passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair." He moved his head slowly and looked at me in the face without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at the heart of it. I turned cold at heart under it. I turned cold at heart, even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back, as if in the agony of death, and he showed the gleaming teeth between. The word I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with intolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbour. He too was looking at me with the same startling pallor in his face, and the same stony glitter in his eyes. Passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger in the seat beside my own and saw, oh heaven, how shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men like myself. A pale phosphorescent light of putrefaction, played upon their awful faces, upon their hair dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living. Those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through the rift of a stormy cloud, a ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by, and I awoke one morning from a deep sleep. I found my wife watching by my bedside. I'll pass over the scene that ensued, and give you in half a dozen words the tale that she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new... close against the junction of the old crossroad and the new, and had only been saved by certain death, by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that had accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and compound fracture of the skull. Letters in my pocket-book showed my name and my address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and thanks to youth and fine constitution I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had occurred to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream, born of the fever in my brain. We discussed the question over and over again, until we found we could discuss it with temper no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago I was the 4th passenger in that phantom coach. Good God, that shit was long. How long was that? Oh... Oh, it was only 10 pages? It felt like so much longer. Alright. I've got 1 or 2 more in me.
I've got one or two more in me. Let me do one from China. I like those. This is from Strange Tales from a Chinese studio. We will do... Wild Dog. During the rebellion led by Yu Qi, men died in countless numbers, mown down like the fields of hemp. At this time, a peasant by the name of Li Hualong was trying to find his way home through the hills when he came across a detachment of government troops on the night march. Afraid of being rounded up indiscriminately as a bandit and seeing nowhere to hide, he lay down in a heap of decapitated corpses. Oh, wait, no, we've read this one. Done for, done for. Two fangs, each over 4 inches long. No idea what beast it was. Right. Okay, yeah, no, we've done this one. Alright, let me do this again. Doodle-doo. We'll do Grace and Pine. Number 21. Kong Sui, a descendant of the great sage Confucius, or Kong Fu Zi, was a man of generous spirit and great refinement of character, and an accomplished poet. A close friend of his, who had been appointed magistrate at Tiantai, wrote inviting him to come and stay, and Kong set off for Tiantai, only to find on arrival that his friend had died. Stranded without lodgings and without means to travel home, he put up in the Putuo Temple, where monks gave him work as a copyist. 100 years or so west. Wow, 100 yards or so west of the temple stood a mansion of a gentleman named Shan, a member of a distinguished local family who, having become involved in a protracted and ruinously expensive lawsuit, had taken his dependents to live in the country, leaving the place deserted. One day, Kong was out in a driving blizzard, the sort of weather in which everyone decides to stay indoors, and happened to pass by the Shan mansion, where he saw an elegantly attired and handsome-looking young man emerge from the main entrance. The man also caught sight of Kong, and, hurrying over to him, greeted him courteously and invited him to step outside of the snow. Kong took an instant liking to the stranger and gladly followed him inside, looking around him with curiosity as he went. The various rooms of the mansion, though not particularly large, were hung with numerous fine embroidered hangings, antique calligraphy scrolls, and paintings. Kong spotted a slim volume lying on the table, entitled Jottings from a Distant Realm, and leafing through it, was a trifle puzzled to find that it was a work completely unknown to him. He had assumed that the young man must be a member of the Shan family, since he was living in the Shan residence, and did not bother to inquire into his family background and the connections. The young man, for his part, asked Kong in some detail about his own predicament, and seemed most sympathetic to his plight. He encouraged him to set himself up as a tutor and start a little school. Alas, sighed Kong, I am stranded from home and can think of no one to act as my patron in such an enterprise.
If you would not consider it beneath you, said the young man, I myself would be glad to be your first pupil and sit at your feet. Kong was touched by this gesture of friendship, but modestly declined to assume the role of a young man's teacher, insisted that they should remain simply as friends. Tell me, he asked, why has this splendid house been closed for so long? It used to belong to the Shan family, replied the young man. But the young master went to live in the country, and ever since then it has been allowed to go to ruin. My own name is Huang Fu. My ancestors hail from the Shaanxi province, far to the west. Our own home was burned down in a large fire, so we're lodging here temporarily at present. Kong now knew at least that the young man was not a member of the Shan family. The two continued to spend a most convivial evening together, and ended up sharing the same bed that night. At daybreak, the young page boy came in to light a fire in their room, and Huang Fu rose and went off into the inner apartments, while Kong sat up in bed with a quilt wrapped around him. Presently the page boy returned to announce that the master was coming, and Kong hurriedly rose from the bed, just as a white-haired old man entered the room.
I must thank you, sir,
said the old man, speaking most courteously,
for deigning to take my son in hand. At present he writes very indifferent prose, and I trust you will not allow considerations of friendship to interfere with whatever discipline you may consider necessary for his progress.
He then presented Kong with an embroidered gown, a sable hat, stockings, and shoes. Kong washed himself and combed his hair, whereupon the old man called for wine and food to be served, and a dazzling banquet was set before them. The food, furniture, the clothes were all of a rare quality, such as Kong never had witnessed in his life. After drinking several cups of wine with his guest, the old man picked up his walking stick and went on his way in high spirits. When the meal was over, young Huang Fu came in to present some of his previous compositions, which were all written in an archaic style, quite unlike the elaborate 8-legged essay required in the old official examinations.
8-legged essay? Chaos, cover your ears.
When Kong questioned him about this, he smiled and replied, I've never had any particular ambition to sit for the examinations. That evening they drank again. Tonight let us enjoy ourselves to the full, exclaimed Huang Fu. Soon, alas, we must turn our minds to more serious matters. He called for his page boy. See if father is asleep yet. If he is, go quietly into Fragrance and ask her to join us. Oh gods, here we go. The boy went and returned carrying a piba mandolin in an embroidered case. Presently, a handsome young woman joined them, dressed in an exquisite gown, and Huang Fu told her to play for them the air known as Bamboo Tears. She plucked the strings with an ivory plectrum, and played with a strange vigor and passion, to the rhythm subtler than any Kong had ever heard. Huang Fu poured wine into large goblets, and they drank together into the early hours. The next day, they rose early to begin their studies. Huang Fu proved to be a gifted pupil, able to memorize texts at a single glance, and in no more than a couple months had he perfected the required prose style. They agreed to have their drinking sessions every 5 days, making a point of always inviting Fragrance to join with them. Once, when Kong was somewhat worse for wine, Huang Fu noticed that his friend could not take his eyes off the girl. Fragrance is just a serving maid, brought up by my father, he commented, continuing in a friendly tone. I understand how lonely you must feel so far away from home. In fact, I've been meaning for some time now to find you a good-looking wife. Then let it be someone like Fragrance, said Kong, to which Huang Fu replied with a smile. As the saying goes, little experience makes a man marvel at little. If Fragrance is your ideal of beauty, then you are easily pleased. One day, when he had already been with them for half a year, Kong felt the urge to go out into the countryside for a stroll. He walked to the entrance of the mansion, and tried the door only to find it firmly locked from the outside. When he inquired why this was so, Huang Fu told him that his father was anxious to discourage contact with strangers who might disrupt the progress of his studies. Kong seemed to accept this explanation. The summer was hot and muggy, and they decided to hold their lessons outside in one of the garden pavilions. It was about at this time that Kong began to develop a strange swelling on his chest, which was at first the size of a peach, then overnight grew into the size of a large bowl. It gave him great pain, and caused him to groan constantly. Huang Fu came to visit him morning and night, but Kong slept and ate little, and soon began to waste away, his condition gradually deteriorating to the point where he ceased eating and drinking altogether. Huang Fu's father came to call on him, and both he and his son lamented their guest's critical state. "Last night I was thinking about Mr. Kong's illness," said young Huang Fu to his father, "and I felt sure that my sister Grace would be able to cure him. Just now I sent someone to grandmother's to fetch her. I wonder why she is so long coming." Just at that moment the page boy came in. "Miss Grace is here," he announced, "with her aunt and cousin, Miss Pine." Father and son hurried out to meet them, and a little while returned, accompanied by Huang Fu's younger sister Grace, a girl of 13 or 14 years, with a bright sparkle in her eyes, and a figure as supple and blithe as a young willow. When Kong set his eyes on her beauty, his spirits suddenly lifted. He at once forgot his pain and ceased his groans. "This is my dear friend Kong," said Huang Fu. "He is a brother to me. Care for him well." A little coyly, Grace rolled back her sleeves, approached his bed, and began taking Kong's pulse. As she held his wrist, he became aware of a perfume more fragrant than that of the rarest orchid. "No wonder," she concluded with a gentle smile. "The heart meridian has been affected. He has a very serious illness, but it can be cured. The swelling is already hardening, so we will have to cut it away." She took a golden bracelet from her arm and placed it on the diseased part, pressing it down gently. The swollen flesh rose an inch or more above the bracelet, but the base of the swelling was somehow contracted and contained, becoming considerably less extended than it was before. With her free hand, she untied her sash and took from within her gown a knife with a razor-sharp blade, as fine as a sheet of paper. Pressing the bracelet with one hand and holding the knife in the other, she cut lightly and deftly along the base of the swelling. Dark blood gushed from the wound, staining the mat on the bed beneath him. But Kong, who now craved nothing but the proximity of this beautiful girl, not only was oblivious to the pain, but dreaded more than anything else the completion of the operation, since it threatened to bring with it departure and a premature end to their short-lived intimacy. "Damn, this dude is lonely." Soon the diseased flesh had been excised in one piece, like a chunk of rotten wood cut from a tree. The girl called for water in which to bathe the wound, and then from her mouth she spat out a red bolus, a pill the size of a large bullet, pressing it into the wound and turning it round and round. At first turn he felt a burning sensation, at the second an insistent tingling, at the third a lightness that permeated his body to the very marrow of his bones. The girl put the bolus back into her mouth and swallowed it. "There, you are cured," she said, and hurried out. Kong leaped up to thank her, as if he had never been ill at all. But his sufferings were not at an end. Now he found himself yearning more and more for her beauty, abandoning his books and sitting for hours musing on nothing, listless and dead to the world. "I think I may have found the right person for your brother Kong," said Huang Fu, perceiving his condition. And who is that, pray? Mumbled Kong. A cousin of mine. Kong brooded for a while before replying, Do not trouble yourself for nothing. He stared at the wall and heaved a deep sigh. Speak not of lakes and streams to one who knows the splendor of the sea. The clouds around the magic peaks of Ul are the only clouds for me. Huang Fu grasped the meaning at once. The cloud-wrapped peaks of Wu having once been the scene of a famous love encounter. My father admires your great accomplishments and has long wanted to see you marry into our family. But Grace is my only sister, and she's still much too young to marry. My cousin Pine, on the other hand, is 18 years old and a good-looking girl. If you don't believe me, see for yourself. I'm relieved that they pointed out that 13 was too young. Yeah. If you don't believe me, see for herself. She takes a walk every day in the garden. You can observe her from the front chamber. Kong did as his friend suggested and watched Grace walking in the garden in the company of another young lady of great beauty, with dark arched eyebrows and tiny feet encased in phoenix-patterned slippers. Kong observed to his great joy that she was every bit as beautiful as Grace, and asked his friend to arrange the match at once. The very next day, Huang Fu emerged from the women's quarters and hailed his friends. Congratulations, everything is settled. A separate courtyard was set apart for the wedding. Without further ado, the very night, the merry music of drums and pipes sounded in the house. Throughout the wedding ceremony, Kong gazed blissfully at his bride, wondering if he was still on Earth or had been transported to the Palace of the Moon. Once the ritual had been completed, their love was joyfully... They did what man and wife do sometimes when... Yeah. They did things. Shortly after this, Huang Fu came to Kong one evening and spoke to him in an unusually serious tone. I can never forget everything you've taught me, but since Lord Chan will shortly conclude his court case and urgently requires the use of this mansion, my family would be obliged to leave here and travel west. It is unlikely that you and I will meet again. It causes me great sorrow to say farewell. Kong wanted to go with them, but Huang Fu urged him to return home to his own family. Kong protested that this would be hard for him to do. Don't worry, said Huang Fu. I shall take you there. Presently the father came with Pine and presented Kong with a gift of 100 taels of silver. Huang Fu led both Kong and his wife by the hand, ordering them to close their eyes and on no account look. And presently they felt themselves soaring through space. Wow, that took a turn. They could hear nothing but the wind whistling in their ears. There, you are home now, said Huang Fu after a while. They opened their eyes and beheld Kong's native village. This was the first time he knew for sure that Huang Fu was no ordinary mortal. He knocked happily on his family's door, and his mother could not believe her eyes. But her happiness at seeing her son again was eclipsed by her delight at the beautiful wife that he had brought home with him. As for Huang Fu, when Kong turned to look for him, he had vanished. Pine proved a devoted daughter-in-law, and her beauty and virtue became widely known in the district. In the course of time, Kong passed his 3rd degree, qualified as a metropolitan graduate, and was appointed a junior magistrate in the city of Yan'an. He proposed taking his whole family with him to the post, and although his mother thought the journey too long and resolved to stay at home, Pine went with him, having meanwhile borne him a son, whom they called Little Lord. At his new post, Kong fell foul of a visiting censor and relieved of his duties. He was temporarily confined to Yannan's region and not allowed to travel home. Once he was out hunting in the nearby fields when he saw a handsome young man ride toward him on a black horse, staring at him intently. On closer inspection, who should it turn out to be but his dear young friend, Huang Fu? They halted their horses, and the two friends laughed and wept at their reunion. Huang Fu invited Kong to go with him to his new home. They came to a village in the thicket of trees. whose leaves were so dense that they shut out the sun altogether. The doors of the house were embossed with great gilt studs, indicating the establishment of a considerable distinction. Huang Fu told him that his sister Grace was now married, and Kong also learned, to his great sorrow, that Pine's mother, his mother-in-law, had died. He spent the night there and returned the following day with Pine and their son. Grace put her arms around their little boy and began playing with him. "You have mingled our two species, cousin," she teased Pine secretly. Kong, for his part, expressed his heartfelt thanks to Grace for having saved his life. "You are such an important man now," she replied, "and your old wound is completely healed. But you still remember the pain." Her own husband, whose name was Wu, also came to pay his respects and persuaded them to stay a second night. In the morning, Huang Fu came to speak to Kong, a woeful expression on his face. "We are facing disaster. I beseech you to save us." Kong asked him to explain his trouble and eagerly assured him that he would do whatever lay in his power. Huang Fu hurried out and assembled his whole family in the main hall, where they proceeded to kneel and give thanks to a bewildered Kong. "The truth is," explained Huang Fu at last, "we are not of human stock. We are all foxes." Oh my god! What? Oh! Okay. And today is a terrible thunderstorm is about to strike us. If you are willing to risk your own life to protect us, we may yet be saved. If not, then take your child now and go. Do not let yourself be caught up in our fate." When Kong swore to live or die with them, Huang Fu told them to stand in the doorway, sword in hand. "When the thunder and lightning strike, stand firm and do not move." Kong followed his instructions and took up a stand. Soon black clouds obscured the midday sky, and it grew dark as night. When he looked around him, Huang Fu's mansion had vanished, and in its place he saw a solitary earthen mound projecting into the sky, while beneath it a huge bottomless chasm had opened in the ground. As he looked aghast at this desolate sight, a crash of thunder shattered in the heavens, shaking the hills to their foundations, followed by the driving rain and a fierce gale, which uprooted trees in its path. Dazzled and deafened by the tempest, Kong nonetheless continued to stand his ground firmly, and suddenly, through the swirling darkness, he saw a gruesome monster, with great pointed beak and long claws, rise up from the depths of the chasm, bearing in its arms a human form. As it began to soar upwards through the mist, Kong knew at a glance that the body it was carrying was that of Grace. He leapt forward and struck out with his sword, whereupon the monster let Grace fall from its arms. Another great crack of thunder burst from the heavens, and Kong himself lay dead on the ground. In a little while the storm passed, and Grace regained consciousness, only to see Kong dead by her side. "How can I continue to live," she sobbed bitterly, "when he has given his life for me?" Pine came forward, and the two cousins carried his body into the house. Grace bade Pine to lift up Kong's head, while her brother Huang Fu prized open his mouth with the golden hairpin. Grace then pinched his cheeks and pressed a red bolus into his mouth with her tongue, pressing her lips to his, and pushing the bolus deep into his throat with her breath. Okay. There was a gurgling sound as it descended, and a minute later he regained consciousness, and to his great joy, he saw his family gathered around him. It was as though he had woken from a dream. The place was too desolate for him to be able to settle there, and he proposed instead that they should all return, with him, to his former home. They agreed to this except for Grace. When Kong saw how downcast she was, he suggested that she bring her husband with her, but that left the unresolved problem of his parents, who would be loath to be separated from his son. They had been discussing the matter all day when suddenly a young servant came in, rushing in from the Wu household, breathless and drenched in perspiration, to announce that the entire Wu family had perished in that day in a natural calamity. Wow! Grace was beside herself with grief and stamped the ground, sobbing inconsolably. There was nothing now to prevent them from returning with Kong. He made all the necessary arrangements, while they spent several days packing their things. When they reached Kong's home, Huang Fu and Grace were installed in a separate compound in the garden. They kept their gate permanently shut, only opening it for Kong and Pine. Kong joined Huang Fu and his sister for the occasional game of chess, a cup of wine, and a convivial conversation. They were like members of a single family. His son, Little Lord, grew up into a good-looking man, always with a touch of the fox about him. Every time he went into town, folk knew he was the son of a fox. And that was the longest, weirdest story yet in Strange Tales of a Chinese Studio. And my voice is fucking dying. I've been streaming for 2 hours and 20 minutes. No wonder my throat feels like absolute garbage. So I think it's here that I'm gonna call it. But hopefully you guys enjoyed yourselves. I should be back tomorrow with something, be it Phasmo or Nier or what have you. Thank you for keeping me awake while I work. Have a good night. Always a pleasure, Sassy. And honestly, I'm really happy. Some of you guys have come up to me and explained that people really like the VODs of these things. And I hope that they bring you comfort too. Alright, fine. Zerp, one last bird fact. So, you know how owls are considered to be smart and wise? So, the reason for that is that the owl was the symbol of the Greek god Athena, who was the patron goddess of wisdom and being smart and strategy and shit. Owls themselves are not actually that smart. They're not stupid, but they're not particularly smart. But in Roman mythology, owls are associated with the coming of death. So that's pretty neat. If you heard an owl hooting at night, it was considered to be really bad luck. Which I think is bullshit. Owls are cool as hell. But, yeah. That's it for my sore ass throat. In the meantime, though, do not eat or drink any questionable substances. Owls are awesome. Owls are fucking cool. Do not eat or drink any questionable substances. Make smart decisions. Do not die. Dying is absolutely forbidden, and I will see all of you wonderful people at a later time. Take care, guys. Goodbye! Oh my god. We are Squeaker McSqueakinsons now. We are the squeakiest of squeaks. I'm gonna feel that in the morning.